Good afternoon. My name is Terry, and this is my submission for the observation presentation. So let's get into it. Opening wishes and goals. The first topic that was discussed within opening wishes and goals is that the counselor started the session by discussing what confidentiality is. Confidentiality is privacy between counselor and client of all information that is obtained during a therapy session. Oftentimes, the counselor admitted that parents become curious about what their adolescent is discussing in a session. The counselor then reassured the client that he will not divulge any information over the phone and connect with the parents by scheduling a meeting with the parent and the client and discussing with the client what they will freely share within that session as to maintain boundaries between the counselor and the client. Which leads us to the next discussion of exceptions of that confidentiality, which does not protect the client when there's intent to harm oneself or others, along with witnessing abuse of any kind. The behaviors that were observed in opening wishes and goals was that throughout the entire session, the client portrayed emotions of happiness within her parents, her school, and her hobbies. However, the client revealed that at times she feels lonely because she is an only child and both her parents work and do not always have time to spend with her or to enjoy their own hobbies. The counselor also portrayed happiness throughout the duration of the session while also using active listening skills while the client was sharing. The three-step emotional change trick. The three-step emotional change trick consists of 3 steps. The first step is to allow yourself to feel the emotion in the moment that it's happening, which can look different depending on the person and the emotion. The important thing is checking in with your body and just feeling the emotion and feeling it until you are ready to stop feeling that emotion. Which leads us to step 2. Step 2 begins with thinking a new thought or physically doing a new activity. For instance, thinking a new thought could be thinking about an upcoming event that the person is excited about. As for examples of an activity to do to change one's mood is reading, coloring, and even taking a walk. The third step is once the client has become in a good mood after completing step 2, they should spread the good mood. In this video, the client expressed that when she was in a good mood, she liked to hug her parents and cook them dinner. The behaviors that were exhibited within this session portray comfortability and happiness within the client and counselor, which exhibit a well-established and appropriate relationship between client and counselor. What's good about you? The What's Good About You is a type of game that counselors use to gather information on a client's self-esteem. This is done by asking the same question, what's good about you, 10 times. And the only rule for this game is that the client is unable to use the same answer twice. The counselor then repeats the response of the client, says thank you, and offers a smile. Once the question is completed, the counselor made sure to check back in with the client and ask what she had thought about the exercise. The client revealed that after the exercise was complete, she thought that the responses had contained multiple similarities, and the counselor agreed. The counselor then explained that the similarities provided insight on who a client is using their own words. In this observation, the counselor provides insight to the client that based on the answers about what's good about her is that she is effortful, thoughtful, creative, intelligent, and a hard worker. The client then agreed that those traits fit the description of what she believes is good about herself. The observed behavior from this session portrayed a healthy relationship between client and counselor, where both parties had emotions of happiness and comfortability throughout the duration of the session. Closing and summary. The closing portion of the session began with recapping all the information that was discussed in the session, starting with opening wishes and goals. The counselor began this by recapping the first wish of the client, making sure that the client agreed with the original response, and then offering feedback on how to obtain the first wish. This was then continued on with the remaining of the client's wishes. The last portion of the interview was to check back in with the client and ask what they thought about the interview. And this should be done by paraphrasing the question, to be open about agreeing or disagreeing with any portion of the session on the client side or the counselor side. The behavior that was observed throughout the duration of this session portrayed emotions of happiness and trust between a client and counselor. Additionally, the client expressed feelings of loneliness at times, but the range was normal. Additionally, the client expressed that they have ample coping strategies which align with the 3-step emotional change trick. Application of theory. The psychological theory that was applied to observation for the first 3 videos was using person-centered therapy, which was coined by American psychologist Carl Rogers in the early 1940s. Person-centered therapy revolves around the idea of basic human drive for autonomy while simultaneously steering away from external controls that promote equality within the counselor-client relationship. Cook and Mock, 2020. Anger management. The session began with asking the client, if our time goes well, what would we have accomplished? The next portion of the session was obtaining information about past events when anger issues were not manageable by the client. Once the client was finished sharing, the next portion of the session was emotional injuries. Emotional injuries are not physical, but emotional and can affect the client long term. The client expressed that showing emotions is considered a weakness for him and makes him feel vulnerable, which allowed for the counselor to come to the conclusion that the trigger of the client is a sense of feeling weak. The next portion of the session was projective or presuppositional questions, which is asking the client what is a feel-good quality about themselves. Once the client expresses the feel-good quality of themselves, you ask the client what that quality would look like in 2 years' time. 2 years' time. Then the last portion of the session was asking the client how they ask for help and how they will continue to ask for help when their anger becomes unmanageable. Motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is about using strategies to increase clients' motivation to change. The first strategy that was observed is asking the client permission to ask difficult questions. One question that was asked to the client was, "What is good about drinking?" The second strategy is making links to lifestyle and stress. For instance, asking the client based on the amount of alcohol consumption, does that interfere with their lifestyle and stress levels, which can be emotionally positive or negative. The client revealed that the amount of alcohol consumption does play a role with the stress level and self-esteem. The next step was to ask the client an open question on self-assessment. Towards the end of motivational interviewing, the counselor asked 4 questions known as the cage question. The first question is cutting down on alcohol, addresses cutting down on alcohol consumption. The second question was asking the client if they've ever felt annoyed when asked to cut down on drinking. The third is if there was any feelings of guilt when consuming alcohol. And the last one is if the client has ever experienced an eye-opener moment, such as drinking in the morning to get over a hangover. The psychological theory that was applied to both observations in anger management and motivational interviewing is cognitive behavioral therapy, which was coined by American psychologist Beck in the 1960s. Utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy would aid in understanding the clients better by exploring the thought process and changing negative thoughts into positive thoughts. Lastly, research has found that cognitive behavioral therapy is effective in addressing substance use disorder and reducing mood symptoms. Neuroletta 2023. Cognitive behavioral session. The beginning of a cognitive behavioral session begins with setting an agenda. Typically, when setting an agenda, it is also referred to as a problem list to clients. Once the client begins to share their problem list is when to ease into asking questions related to setting the agenda. The next step in the session is exploring the thought process of the client. This is done by using an exercise of breaking down the thought process that can lead to emotional states. After exploration of the thought process, the next step in the session is to rephrase the negative thoughts into positive ones. One example from the session was the client said, "I am not a good storyteller." The counselor then told the client to rephrase that into a positive thought, such as, "I am a good storyteller." Behavior that is exhibited within the client in the session aligns with social anxiety. For instance, the client expresses that weekly they are required to participate in an inclusion activity, which is to answer an icebreaker question in front of the whole class. Even when the client is aware of this activity every week, they still have feelings of nervousness and embarrassment. Thus, the solution of cognitive behavioral therapy would be for the homework to prepare for the inclusion activity and change the thought process to positive ones. Mental status examination. The beginning of this session was asking the client if they would be willing to answer some questions. The questions were easy and contained questions such as asking their full name and the day of the week. Later in the session was a memory test with 3 words, which the client was able to complete. Next was a series of mental exercises that included a math exercise, a spelling exercise, and memory of current and previous presidents. The next portion of the session comprised of asking the client to rate their current emotional state. Then checking in with the client if they have repeating thoughts, delusions, or odd beliefs or hallucinations, which were all within normal range of the client. The next portion of the session was asking questions to measure the client's abstract thinking and access for empathy and social interest. Biblical worldview integration. Integration of a biblical worldview is useful in sessions to aid the client in aligning their belief system into an active role in therapy sessions and treatment plans. A biblical worldview allows for agreeing that asking for help is acceptable and found in Scripture. For instance, Scripture highlights the importance of finding support within people and leaning on God in times of need. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. Proverbs 11, chapter 11, verse 14. Application of learning. I learned that the structure of conducting session varies but follows similar framework. Also through observation, I learned that the importance of asking the client permission before asking questions. This includes asking permission again when questioning shifts or becomes more difficult. Through these observation videos, I have also learned that check-ins with clients should be done multiple times throughout the session. Check-ins will be a viable part of my future sessions and will be applied by simply asking the client how they are feeling. Lastly, I learned that each client is unique in their own experiences, and that asking clients open-ended questions encourages clients to share. That is all I have for my presentation. Thank you.